Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me here today. And I hope that you will enjoy this lecture more than me being interrupted multiple times and having to start recording it more than 10 times. So it's 7 p.m. and the first time I started recording this lecture was 3 p.m. I had some interruptions, but I hope that that will not affect your understanding of content analysis. It is another research method that we are covering. And the first thing that I would like to ask you at the beginning of this lecture is, what do you think that content analysis is? So you had a chance to read the textbook chapter about content analysis and gain some understanding of this research method. So what do you think it is? What does it mean? Let's just analyze the content and make some inferences based on the content we analyzed. If we look at this early definition about content analysis is a quantitative, systematic, and objective technique for describing the manifest content of communication. So now let's dissect this definition and see what each component means. Quantitative, it means that we must count occurrences of what we are interested in. If, for example, we are reading the New York Times and some of their article covers a violent protest overseas in the Middle East, then one of the things that we could be interested in is how did the New York Times portray this protest? Did they put the emphasis on the protester, or did they put the emphasis on the government? Who was at fault? Who was guilty? How are you going to identify who are the villains and who are good people in that article? So we need to search for words or search for certain terms that would lead us to understand, that would actually help us understand whether there are more number of words or phrases used that portray this protest in a negative light, or there are more phrases and words used that are actually kind of supportive of the protest. Another thing about the quantitative content analysis is that it is systematic. We must count all relevant aspects of the sample. So if we collect news articles from a news website, we need to look at all the samples. We're not going to be biased and look at only what is convenient to us, but we really need to cover multiple aspects. Objective, we select units for analysis and categorize them using clearly defined criteria. I will later provide an example of how I selected news articles for a study that I conducted, and how I selected these news articles that actually represent units of analysis, how I decided to look at specific sections on news websites and just select articles from those sections. And then we're going to look at the manifest content, that is something that is tangible or observable. If we look at the New York Times article about the protest, maybe we want to just look at, if, let's say, the New York Times has words such as violence present in that article, because we want to see the protest based on that depiction in the New York Times article was violent or not. We really need to look at things that are observable and quantifiable. I wanted to provide one example, and this is from the New York Times, about the Omicron virus spread. And the reason for this is because I wanted to show you how one of the things that we can do with the content analysis is just look at headlines of the news articles but this is why we need to do this process in a systematic way. You want to look at headlines from, let's say, multiple websites, but they had to be about the same topic, as you want to determine, for instance, how they framed this pandemic, like what kind of frames did they emphasize in those headlines, negative or positive? What was the focus of their articles related to the pandemic, and so on, the Omicron virus spread? Sampling, coding, and counting. that is what content analysis represents. It allows us to look into this media content and make inferences based on what we see. But I frequently use media examples for one reason, and that is because my expertise is in um, mass media. So I do research in mass communication and journalism, but I also have a background in journalism. So I'm always interested in this type of content, but that's not the only thing you could analyze. You saw an example from the textbook about looking around campus, searching for those professors who have stickers in their car that are supportive of certain political parties or representatives of those parties and so on. And other things that you could also do is analyze billboards or radio material or web content. You could also analyze maps, letters, tweets, Instagram photos. That's one of the interesting areas to look at. Tweets, for instance, you could look at see whether people are more likely to express frustration or are they more likely to spread some positivity on Twitter. I think it's the former, but let's not get into many details about it. What are main steps of the analysis? The first thing we need to do before we start the analysis is pose a research question or figure out which hypothesis we are going to test. If we have enough material, if there's enough research in that area, maybe we just want to test the hypothesis instead of posing a research question. Another thing is defining the content that should be analyzed, sampling that content. So what am I going to analyze? I'm going to analyze news article. But which news articles are you going to analyze? I'm going to focus on 5 major newspapers in the United States. Yes, but then what is the next step? Like, what kind of articles are you going to analyze? Are they going to be related to politics, entertainment, social issues, and so on? So you need to figure all of these things out and select units for coding. So that those units could be news articles, develop the codings, figure out how you're going to code each item actually, because as I mentioned, there are articles on politics, sports, social issues, entertainment, and so on. And then you will assign each occurrence of a unit in the sample to a code. You will find codes as I mentioned, you could want your code could be social media presence in online news, but then how are you gonna define social media presence? What social media is? What social media are you going to look at? Facebook, Twitter, Instagram? You need to list all of them. And I have a problem with my computer again. And at the end, you will analyze data, report results, and make inferences. Now, what are content analysis units? They could be physical, so they occupy observable space or time, like a comic strip, for instance. You could analyze that. Syntactical units of language, such as words, sentences, or books. Categorical, they need to have something in common. So you could analyze content at events such as drinking beer or a specific time of a movie character. That could be categorical unit of analysis. Propositional represents structures such as stories and books or dramas. And thematic are broad topics within a structure such as relationships with the boss or peers. Now, to explain through an example what units of analysis represent, and also to explain how this coding process looks like and how should this research method be performed, I wanted to show you an example that I mentioned at the beginning. And this is my relatively recent research study about utilization of social media in online news. I wanted to, I actually employed this gatekeeping perspective. Gatekeeping perspective is reflected in this concept of keeping the info, like deciding which information you're going to make available to a wider population, to the public. So if you're a journalist, you might make a decision that certain information should be kept from the public, or your editor could make that decision. And I wanted to see, considering that now with the spread of social media, where information goes from one source to another so fast, I wanted to see to what extent are actually news organizations able to maintain this gatekeeping role. And I also wanted to see whether, and that includes incorporating content from social media in their news. So basically there's this publicly available content, but media gives it like a stronger voice if it publishes it on their website. Now, I wanted to examine utilization of social media in online news across 10 websites. What did I do? I wanted to identify actually 10 websites that I'm going to analyze. So I looked at ratings of news websites. I looked at several sources, and then I started working on, and then I identified 10 top websites. And then another thing was to, after selecting them, those websites included the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and so on. And then after that, I was looking at sections that are common to them before I define from which sections I wanted to derive my sample. Why is this important? Because if I'm going to look at all these websites, and if I'm going to pull news articles from specific sections, I want to make sure that the websites I'm looking at have these sections. So the sections included politics, US news, world, business, economy, sports, and entertainment. And then I basically looked at, I wanted to derive 3 articles per website. So I had a total of 180 news articles. My friend joined me in this study, so we worked on it together. We analyzed this 180 articles. When we selected them, we used the random number generator. That's really important for objectivity. So we didn't just select news articles that were convenient to us. We basically wanted to select news articles published in October, November, and December. We looked at 3 days of 3 months. We selected these days randomly by using a random number generator. And then we collected stories from these websites, 180 stories, and started analyzing them. So what kind of conclusions did we make from the analysis, and how did we organize this analysis? So when we collected websites, we actually had a specific coding, we had like this coding framework that we created, so we knew exactly how to identify items in news articles. So for instance, one of the things that we looked at was the number of social media posts. So in the code book that we created, we had exactly the list of social media that could potentially be included in these articles. And finally, what we did is that we looked at entertainment section, politics, sports. We looked at the number of social media posts that appeared in news articles of these sections. So what does that mean? We, for example, found 46 social media posts in entertainment stories. And then in politics, we found 30, 19 in sports, and so on. What is the reason for having this, like the greatest number of social media posts in entertainment stories? It is when we looked at, and this is more, let's say, I would say that we shifted a little bit toward qualitative content analysis. We looked more in depth to see what was going on and what were the reasons for like this section having so many posts. So aside from just counting the social media posts, we looked at what was going on there. And then we noticed that basically social news articles, they utilize this content because there are many celebrities online who simply post stuff on social media and they share some interesting information, and then news organizations are simply interested in sharing further that information because they believe it is newsworthy, it is important. And another thing, the reason why politics was second on the list, when we emphasized that in our research study, it was because Donald Trump was the US president at the time. And frequently he would post stories on Twitter, he would post important information on Twitter, and news media would simply take that information and republish it, incorporate his tweet into their stories. And this is the reason why politics was second on that list. We also looked at the number of sources from social media incorporated in this article. So one of the things that we looked at, for instance, was whether news media utilized official or unofficial sources from social media. And then to make sure, because not one coder is enough, you need to have like two coders to make sure that your data is reliable. So there needs to be a definition, like a detailed codebook, or how are you going to assess official and unofficial sources? How do you know whether the source is official or not? So for example, if that source is, if this account carries a blue tick on Twitter, that we can consider it an official source. If it doesn't, then it is unofficial. That's one of the ways to make sure that all coders understand what are you referring to when you're talking about official or unofficial sources. So these are some details about my study. And then another thing that you could frequently find, I think, in scholarly articles is basically people who looked at content, especially advertising content on content that incorporates health messages. They want to look at how these messages are framed. Framing basically means that messages are created in a way that make you think in a certain way. So when it comes to health messages, one of the things that you could research is whether they emphasize this gain frame or loss frame. So what does it actually mean? You could see gain frames focus on the positive outcome. So a message is framed in a way that it focuses on a positive outcome. An example of that is if you get a COVID booster shot, you will be protected against severe illness. So you're getting the shot and you're getting something positive out of it. But there are also loss frames, and they emphasize negative consequences if you do not accept a certain behavior. So an example of such a message would be if you don't get a COVID booster shot, you're at high risk for severe illness. Some of the strengths of content analysis is that this is a systematic process. It requires rigorous coding and counting. Research material is available, so you can just download tweets and analyze them. You can go to Instagram, download pictures, look at how many people posted comments under a picture that promotes some activity like swimming or running or spinning, whatever, and see how people reacted to that, and make inferences such as and make inferences such as that people that this type of content elicits positive or negative comments and so on. Research, it is not research on human subjects, so we don't need IRB approval, but if we are dealing with certain content where people want to be anonymous, such as closed Facebook groups, perhaps, you should consider asking IRB if you should get an approval for such a study. This type of research method also allows you to make generalizations about content. And also one of the things is that you can create a content analysis and collect data and be sure that the data and the method that you use is reliable. How do you ensure that your measures are reliable? You could, for instance, one of the most common things to do is to conduct intercoder reliability For example, when I analyzed content with my friend, we selected certain portion of the content, such as, let's say, 20% or 10% of the news articles. So she coded them as well, and then we compared our results. So it is important to have at least 70% of matching results to ensure that your that would be good for an exploratory study, but also 70% is really solid for you to state that what you have is reliable. You tested into quarter reliability, you match 70%, and you could state that you provided this reliable measurement. Weaknesses of such a method is that it addresses only questions of content. So there are no people, you could just examine somebody's content, but you could say, oh, this is how many people engage in discussion on Twitter, but you don't know other elements of it because you cannot talk to people. You're just examining the content they produce. It is useful only for comparisons, primarily useful when it's used for comparisons, favors counting over the search for meaning. So we're just looking at the numbers, but then I mentioned this example of the study that I conducted. So I had to provide some context. So when I was looking at those news articles, I noticed that news articles on politics, embed a lot of tweets, but then on the other hand, Donald Trump was very active at that time. And for that reason, that was the reason why there was a greater number of embedded social media posts in news articles on politics than on sports or economics. Another weakness of content analysis that it is problematic with abstract content, and validity could be an issue as well. Like, are you really measuring what you're supposed to measure? But this problem exists with all other research methods. So one of the best, reliability could also be very challenging because, and that is why many journals accept reliability of 70% or 80%, because it is very hard to achieve agreement among two coders. Even when you have a detailed, well-defined code book, it could sometimes be challenging to achieve an agreement. It could be challenging to achieve an agreement of 100% among coders. And validity basically can be problematic in terms of relating the findings to the external world. So that's one of the problems related to the measurement. And I wanted just to briefly touch upon qualitative content analysis. So I think it's necessary because it could provide some context. It also provides in-depth context of some content. This type of analysis also had its own coding system, but that coding system is not reflected in numbers. So if you look at news articles, or if you look at, let's say, Instagram pictures, and what you want to see is how many comments did someone elicit through their Instagram photos. Let's say if you look at some celebrities, you want to see how many comments they elicit for certain positive messages that they shared on Instagram versus some messages where they express concern or where they were going to some PR crisis situation. So you want to see like what's the number of comments that both these posts elicited. But then on the other hand, you can do this with the qualitative content analysis. Qualitative content analysis would be more interested in like looking at some context, looking at other details. It uses this coding system where they don't really look at the numbers. They're actually looking for common themes. So in case of what's the number of comments that that was the outcome of publishing this Instagram picture, instead of like looking at the number of comments, what you would do is looking at, perhaps if you're doing a qualitative content analysis, you would perhaps look at what are some of the comments that people posted, like some common themes among those that were positive or negative? What kind of a message did they emphasize? So was there like a common message that they utilize in this positive or negative comment? So you would look at certain commonalities among these comments and identify common patterns, common themes that appear. So there would be some sort of a coding book, but it's just not reflected in numbers, but rather in concepts and words. So you would look, for instance, you would look at keywords and concepts. So for example, you could search for a word frequency and how they are used in context. So let's take a look at the keywords or key concepts from this presentation, from this content analysis. So content analysis presentation. So some of the key things are that we are analyzing content, that we need to apply this strict sampling procedure, that we need to make sure that we're not selecting content that is convenient to us, but that we are being unbiased in collecting content and sampling it. We need to apply a strict coding procedure to make sure that our coding matches somebody else's coding, which is what we call intercoder reliability. We need to select units of analysis and ensure that our method and the way we conducted our content analysis, our content analysis is reliable and valid. And one of the things that we want to do in case we're conducting a qualitative research study, and if we want to utilize qualitative content analysis to collect data, then we're most likely to look for keywords in context. And I have an exercise for you. So I want you to look at this exercise 3. It is in chapter 11, page 235. So complete that exercise, write about 200 to 250 words and post the exercise under news media bias content analysis. And that is basically all that I had for you for today. This lecture is over. Again, it started about more than 4 hours ago now, but I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions about content analysis or anything else, just send me an email or schedule a meeting with me. Have a great week. Bye-bye.